I'm going to give you a bit of an introduction to medieval literature because it's kind of an odd period in our history, in our literature, because it isn't really one period. We're going to treat it as one, but it's more than any other time period we're going to cover. It's really at least two, possibly three time periods, because they're very distinct. They don't really, yeah. So think of medieval literature in two different stages, at least, if not three. Let me walk over some of the elements of it and kind of give you a little bit of a sense of why it's so odd. Let's shrink up. And it's medieval literature. Something to understand that if you understand anything, you know it goes from Old English to Middle English. And that's a dramatically different time period in culture. Okay. So to first go into Old English, it's got its roots in German tribes around, probably, this is very loose, but around zero. And then there was that war with Varus and all that silliness. And when they started to migrate over to England, what is say contemporary England, they brought with them obviously their language, and it didn't change all that much. It did gradually evolve over the course of 500 years. Over the course of 500 years, think about how much English has changed, which is pretty enormous, okay? So originally what you had among these German tribes was an oral literature. They were not a literate society. They did not write things down. They had no need to. They did not know how to read. They had no alphabet for, maybe they might have some, if they did anything, they wrote it on a rock and left. So they did not write down literature. So during that time period, really at all. They began to write when they had kind of settled in England. This was beginning after 500 AD. The original migrations started before then. The Romans, as you listen to the in the podcast, came and then they eventually left. They left them by themselves. And they left them with a lot of ruins to kind of figure out and explain where did all this stuff come from. And Bede was the first one to really start writing things down, and it was during the times of Christianization when things started to be written down, because Christian culture was a written culture. As it was expanding out from Rome, and it was after the Roman Empire had pulled back. Around 400 AD or so, let's say for now. And around 600 AD, they were expanding, not the empire, but the Christianization, the Catholic Church was expanding out and sending people out to spread the word, spread the message of Christianity. And Bede was one of the first writers to take it on, and he wrote the History of the English-speaking Peoples. And he wrote down what we know of as the first poem written in English. He claims it was written by a shepherd or something like that, and his name was Caedmon. Now, let me show you this. This is a map. This one I stole from Wikipedia, but this shows you kind of where they came from. They were coming from Denmark and Germany and things like that. A lot of people don't realize that the Saxons were German. So were the Angles and the Jutes and the Frisians and the Franks and others. They were just migrating over to England again and again, and they were getting into fights with each other, and they were getting along with each other, and they were getting, sometimes the Vikings would show up. It was kind of a mess. So it wasn't nice and organized. And again, it started really before 400, but it was going on for a while. And it went on, into the 400s. It really started to take shape. And then around the 600s, when the Christians came, they started to write things down. So these guys who first showed up, they weren't writing anything down, okay? They just came on over. And then you get texts like Bede's, okay? Let me show you Bede's. And this is Caedmon's hymn. Now, this is Bede's history right up here. And this is written in Latin. He'd written this, and he wrote this down in the footer. That is the first English poem. It's him writing down, Bede writing down what he says was a hymn written by a gentleman named Caedmon. He says, we don't know for sure. There's no way to confirm this. But Bede says this is, and so this is considered to be the first English poem. And it was written down by Bede as part of he had written his history of the English-speaking peoples, and he wrote this as a footnote to it. And so that's where English literature really begins, as a footnote on a Latin history about the English-speaking people. Okay, but let me show you this. This is an early version of The Wanderer, which is a little bit later on. And I want you to notice that this is written in Old English. Old English cannot be read today. So let's blow it up a little bit. Notice that some of the words you might be able to pick oft here, and you can pick up a few others, but not much, okay? Not much. When we read Beowulf, Beowulf was composed in this language. I would say that a modern English speaker could probably understand about 1 to 3, maybe 5 words per page, and can usually not make any sense out of it, okay? And so it was beginning to be written down by Bede and with Caedmon's hymn, and it slowly started to progress until we get Beowulf, okay? We do not know the dates of composition and the authorship. I really want to emphasize, even though Bede put down that Caedmon wrote this hymn, we cannot confirm that, okay? We don't know who Caedmon was. We don't have anything else on him except for the little bit that Bede tells us. And he could be making it up. We don't know, okay? This is a problem with all ancient texts, okay? So I want to emphasize this because this comes up later on. Trying to confirm the claims in the text are next to impossible. Good luck finding out who Caedmon was. We don't have any YouTube videos. We don't have any kind of documentation of where he came from, or birth certificates, or anybody else telling us about him. And then the fact that he was, a shepherd writing pretty advanced poetry, that's a little bit sketchy, okay? So that's where it is in Old English society. And they did speak a form that would have been recognized as German. In fact, a modern German speaker could probably follow along with about 1/3 to 1/2 of the page. A modern German speaker can do that. A modern English speaker, 1 or 2 words per page. But this is the beginnings of the English language. It's mostly German. So let me shrink myself up. And so there's uncertainty of additions and deletions. So when I go through The Wanderer, you're going to see the ending of the poem. It's a little, maybe because nobody had written their name on it, it would be very easy to add things on it. What we don't have is an original book published with somebody's name on it. We don't have anything reliable. The text was handed down. It was possibly composed, we think it may have been composed orally originally, and then eventually written down by the Christian authors. The ending of The Wanderer is a Christian theme. Could it have been added by the Christians who were writing it down for the first time? In other words, they heard this nice poem. Let's make sure it has a Christian twist and add that onto the end. Nobody knows for sure if it did happen or if it didn't. Okay? There's always this uncertainty involved, especially with Old English poetry, And then in 1066, that's when the Norman conquest takes place. William the Conqueror comes from northern France, Brittany, and he was called William the Bastard. He comes up and he takes over England over the course of the year. He basically says, this is mine. And what you have is this conflation of French with English. This usually doesn't happen. There was a hybridization of the 2 languages, French and German, hybridized and became what would become modern English. Okay. And let's jump over to that, because there was a period when the country of England, or the land of England, was basically ruled by people who spoke French, okay, Norman French. But what happened is they did not come in and wipe out the native English language. What happened was a hybridization. They started to work together, the languages, and started to combine. Okay? For a period, you had some pretty heavy French influence. Marie de France wrote in a form of French. Okay, Morte d'Arthur, he said, Thomas Malory, who wrote that, said he was translating the French. Said he was, but whatever. The Pearl poet may have been, we don't know. Okay, in these cases, we do know Marie de France, but sorta, just a little bit, just a bit. We're not really sure about Thomas Malory, the Pearl poet, Gawain. It's really sketchy. Everything changes with Geoffrey Chaucer. Now, Geoffrey Chaucer is labeled as the father of English literature. He's where it really starts. Sorta. But understand this, Chaucer never read Beowulf. He never read Caedmon's Hymn. He didn't know how to read them. There weren't any translations. Understand he's writing in English in England, and he cannot read Beowulf any more than you can. Okay. In fact, he would probably have a harder time than you do. He is a known author. We have a number of texts that refer to him. We have him showing up in legal records and other things. We know he was an ambassador, I believe, to Italy or into France. He traveled back and forth. He was a known person. He was an ambassador. People knew him. And this is the first real person we know. Okay. He is really a break with Old English. I can't emphasize enough. He never read Beowulf. Okay, he never did. He wasn't influenced by it. And so with Beowulf, you do not get, and with Caedmon's Hymn and The Wanderer, you do not get a subsequent influence, history of influence, that comes after it. Instead, those poems stayed in their time period. They've since been rediscovered in the 20th century by people like J.R.R. Tolkien, was an Old English scholar at Oxford. He brought them back. They had been largely forgotten, rarely, if ever, read. Never read in the original. He could read them because he learned Old English as a distinct language. But there was a real break from the Old English into the Middle English. Okay? And Chaucer identified with Dante and with Europe. He wanted to bring English, this language that was really unsophisticated at this time. Okay? It wasn't Old English any longer. It was this hybridization of German and French. You could recognize Chaucer's English. You could read it. Okay, so he identified more with Dante and the Europeans. Dante being a British poet, and the most famous work he has is the Canterbury Tales. Okay, and you can understand it. Let me switch over here for a moment to this screen. This is from Wikipedia. You can follow along with this, okay? And you can read what's being written here. Let me move it a little more into the screen. This is the original text. It says, "This frere boasteth that he knoweth hell, and God I woot that it would little wonder. Freres and fiends being but little asunder." These are the original spellings, and you can basically figure it out. He's saying this friar boasts that he knows hell, and God knows that it is little wonder friars and fiends are seldom apart. You can make sense out of the original Chaucer writing. You can, and this is how he would have spelled it. And he would have read from it. He would have read to an audience mostly of women, but that's how he would have done it, okay? And that's what I want you to know about medieval literature. We are going to be writing on Beowulf, so give that your best. We will cover a few of the tales, Wife of Bath, and I will make optional the Friar's Tale and the Sumner's Tale. Those I will make optional, and I'll give you extra credit for completing the quizzes. And so I do want you to read the Wife of Bath. That'll keep required for a quiz. I want you to write on Beowulf. I want you to read the Wife of Bath. And you can, if you find Chaucer interesting. He is unusual. He is very unusual, okay? But you can have a little bit of fun with it because it's pretty funny. It's pretty unique, okay? What he did introduce was humor, and it's very raunchy humor. You would recognize it as being something that could probably show up on HBO. He takes on religious issues, and he brings Greek and Latin into the English literature. So he brings Greek and Latin into the literature. It did not have a place before him. Okay? All right, guys, I will call it quits there. You now have your introduction to English Lit, and give it your best. Okay? Take care.